Hi everybody. I'm going to talk today about the top-level strategies that are possible to counter disinformation. Everybody in this room thinks that disinformation or misinformation should be a problem, and we're exploring techniques that are computational or political or social science or psychological to try to counter it. I want to talk about sort of the high-level view of how maybe we can put some of these pieces together. This paper could also be called Jonathan Makes a Chart. This is the chart I made. I'm going to try to sort of unpack this for you. But first, why did I pick this topic? Why institutions? Well, I believe that an organized response to disinformation requires institutions. Or maybe another way to say this would be to say that an organized, ongoing response is an institution, right? I want to talk about not just one-off approaches or projects, but how does a society organize to counter this stuff? And a great many of our institutions are responding. Journalism, platforms, the State Department, the Defense Department, academics. There are now multiple ongoing efforts in this country and in other countries. And then why democracies? Well, what I'm not going to talk about in this talk is what disinformation is. I'm just using it as an umbrella term for content that somebody decides is objectionable and needs to be countered. But no matter how you decide what should be countered, you still have the problem of you have to use a method that is politically legitimate. And so I'm asking not only what can you do, but what do we want to do? What are the sort of things that are in accordance with our values in a democracy? Now, there is a long history of counter-disinformation institutions. In this country, mostly these are Cold War institutions. This is just an idea, one of many institutions, but possibly the biggest. This was the US Information Agency, which was shut down after the Cold War. And just to give you an idea of the scope, the US Information Agency once had a staff of 3,000 people and a budget of billions per year. So this was a big deal. And they did a lot of things, including like the Voice of America radio programs, but they also had units that were charged with responding to, in this case, Soviet propaganda. Incidentally, Edward R. Murrow was originally a journalist who was famous for taking down McCarthy. So this was a big deal back in the day. But the Cold War doesn't teach us about how we have to respond in a networked world, right? There were no platforms, there was no viral distribution in the Cold War. Lots of things have changed. So instead, to try to get to the chart that I made, I decided to look at some contemporary institutional work. So what are people doing now? And can I categorize the strategies that they're employing? So I'm going to look at three of them. One is the EU East Stratcom Task Force, which is the European Commission set up to counter Russian propaganda in the Eastern European states. Another is Facebook, which you heard in far more detail about earlier. And the other is the Chinese state, which does a lot of counter-disinformation work. So these are very different organizations. EU East Stratcom Task Force is a sort of classic state-level counter-propaganda organization. They were created by the European Union. They collect disinformation cases from media in several languages with a network of partners, and they write refutations. Basically, every time they see something that's false, they record it in a database of cases, they publish something on social media. And this is what that looks like. This is one of their sites, and it's some sort of general analysis of the information landscape, and it's some specific refutations. In fact, lots of specific refutations. It's very classic stuff. Government run, targeted at another government. Again, you heard earlier about what Facebook is doing in this space. I sort of break it down or think of it as sort of basically three types of countermeasures. One is this idea of targeting inauthentic accounts, and so I'll talk a little bit more about what inauthentic means. The other is this collaboration with fact checkers that you saw earlier. So that's a content level or article level. And there's also a source level or user level content to this, which you saw with the source trustworthiness surveys. And then as far as what they actually do when they identify this, basically flag it or change the ranking. They very seldom outright remove misinformation, as you heard earlier. And I'm sure Alex will correct me if I get some of this wrong. They're also concerned with what they call information operations. So these are organized campaigns by actors in an attempt to persuade, right? So this is, the classic example is the Russian interference in the US 2016 election, but this happens all over the world in, at this point, pretty much every election. And so this is one of the models that they use to think about how these campaigns are organized and how to respond to them. And then China. I include China because they're good at countering information that they don't like, and because they pose challenges for the legitimacy of method. So they're doing many things that we probably would not want to do here, for example. In particular, there are laws against misinformation. That's something that we actually don't have in this country. It's not illegal to lie. But it is in China. And they also have a very large group of paid government posters who post under sock puppet accounts. They're effectively government cheerleaders. This chart is from a wonderful paper which analyzes these sock puppet accounts, the so-called 50 cents party, meaning they're paid 50 cents per post. And all this is a time series of the volume of posts. This paper was based on an enormous trove of leaked worker reports. So we know for sure that these were 50 cent party posts. And you can see that they very clearly align with political events. Not only pre-scheduled things like political meetings and holidays, but political crises like riots or disasters. So then, starting with these three very different types of contemporary counter-disinformation organizations, I asked the question, okay, can we categorize the things that they do? And I'm hoping that categorizing tactics will give us strategies, and that we can say something about which of these strategies are likely to work in a democracy, and which one of them are aligned with our values, which ones of them are legitimate, things that we would want to actually do. So the simplest one is refutation. So you heard this morning about the problems with simply fact-checking or saying that something is false. But it does have an effect if it's consistent, especially, right? So although we know that simply telling something that something we believe is false has limited effect, on a societal scale, this does seem to have impact. Which is not to say that it will change political stances. There seems to be some research that says that you can correct, you can fact check a candidate, but that doesn't make people not vote for them. The other interesting problem with refutation is that disinformation is rarely just a matter of saying something that's false. There's a lot of framing, a lot of sort of half-truths. Again, this morning you saw Claire Wardle's typology of mis and disinformation. That is a weakness of the technique if you can't simply say someone's lying. On the plus side, generally, adding something to the conversation is considered legitimate, right? You can always, it seems to be a norm that responding to bad speech with more speech is fine. You can always do that. So this is what that looks like in the case of EU versus disinfo. They produce these catchy posts and images and videos and other media, each of which refutes a particular item of disinformation. So they just churn this stuff out, right? They do thousands of these per year. They post them across various social media channels. And this is really what it takes. It takes a campaign. You can't just write a fact check. You have to keep repeating that message. And so that's what they do. This is what it looks like in the Facebook context. I categorize Facebook as using refutation. And what I'm talking about when I say that is this fact-checking program that they have. On the left is a very brief description about how it works. So Facebook has internal tools that identify potential misinformation, both algorithmically and from user reports, and and algorithms that run on user reports as well, and then present it to fact-checking organizations, which can then pick what they want to check, and then it appears in the UI in one way or another. And we heard discussion about the design principles for trying to figure out how to show this information. The other big strategy that Facebook is involved in is this phrase, coordinated inauthentic behavior, which has appeared in a lot of the public messaging. The idea here is that you're not punishing the content of a post, you are publishing the fact that something is hidden about it. And this is a basic communicative norm. Pretending to be someone else when you speak is wrong. And it's appealing as a way to target disinformation because you get to not care what they said, only that they were doing something fake, right? Of course, you can still target particular pieces of content. So this is what this type of response looks like. You write an article about somebody saying something while pretending to be someone else, or you remove a bunch of accounts that pretended that they're not from Iran but actually are. Another thing you can do is just say something else. You don't need to refute the story, you just give a different story. The psychological research suggests that this can be more effective. So I can tell you, it's not true that Obama is a Muslim. Or I can tell you Obama is a Christian. And the research suggests that generally the second is stronger. There's also hope or theory that maybe if you give people a narrative first, the counter-narrative will be inoculated against. So, of course, your counter-narrative can itself be disinformation. So this can become a gray area in democracies, which is why much of the US government is prohibited from domestic messaging. So here are two recent examples out of China. This is something China does a lot. So China isn't destroying mosques in the Western provinces. They are appreciating the beauty of cultural diversity. And they're not putting tariffs on American products. They are unveiling a list of exempt products. So you can see that this can vary from sort of wildly out of touch to a spin on factual events. This is the intervention that is truly new. This did not exist in the 20th century. The Cold War just couldn't do this at all. This is changing the algorithms, I call them filtering algorithms, right? The algorithms that decide what it is we see, also called recommendation algorithms. This can be done either by the platform itself when it makes choices about how to change the ranking of things, or by users, which leads to a problem of deciding what is legitimate democratic collective action, tell all your friends to like this post, or what is gaming the system, right? What is inauthentic or bad behavior? And so we have to have some criteria for deciding when we want to punish collective action and when we want to reward it. You can also try to flood the system. You can try to distract. It's sort of a technical means of distraction. If you produce enough posts on a topic, maybe you can get the topic you don't like out of the trending results for the day. So this is one theory about what the 50 Cent Party is doing in China. And Facebook has said on a number of occasions that they change search ranking for things that are labeled as false. You can also just make laws against certain types of speech. So in the US, the Supreme Court says lying is not illegal, with certain exceptions for fraud and so forth. In Europe, they also recommended against trying to regulate misinformation per se. Germany, on the other hand, says that you can't post Nazi material and other types of hate speech. And China actually has a law which says that if an unlawful post, they have something that is misinformation according to their rules, is shared more than a certain number of times, you can go to jail. And people have gone to jail for this. So this is from an excellent longer paper on the Chinese situation. And you can see how this works, right? They are worried about, among other things, ideological chaos, and they will punish it with imprisonment. Here's the German case. And you can start to see the complexity of trying to identify what it is that should be removed. So in this case, Facebook had to remove, let's see, 1,704 complaints, 362 posts in the first 6 months of 2018, and most of them were for insult. And I'm not really sure what that category is. And this can be gamed as well, right? Because you can have a campaign to get content reported. But it can work in the sense of removing a narrow category of speech. Finally, straight up censorship. Generally considered suspect in a democracy. Also difficult to do in a pluralistic media system. It's very hard to make something just disappear from the public sphere. We have so many other options for distributing information right now, especially as we get into these private messaging systems. But even in private messaging systems, you can censor. So WeChat actually blocks certain words, phrases, and images. So here's a simple experiment by Citizen Lab where if you had China arrest human rights defenders in one sentence, those words were removed, but if you just send them individually, they were not. So it's actually censorship at the level of individual conversations. Probably something that most democracies would be hesitant to do. So, putting it all together, here are these high-level strategies, and which one of them will work in a pluralistic regime, and which one of them, which of those or what we think about them, right? Whether we are willing to do these things in a democracy or not. Now, of course, this will vary based on the government and the context and the seriousness of the problem and so forth. But all of the pieces that we're talking about today, the fake news classifiers, the psychological research on persuasion, the issues around context and the politics of disinformation, all of it ultimately has to fit into some larger organizational strategy to have an effect. And I think basically these are the choices. Thank you.
So obviously, really great talk. I guess there's a lot of different strategies that can be pursued by the different groups, and they have trade-offs, right? Have you thought about like the prerogative of like for any of the institutions going more draconian or like some of the stronger things versus like doing nothing and having the problem get worse? Or do you see these more like these rows more as for like the examples using them, they're just like limits and they can't really be transcended?
So I wouldn't say, for example, that you should never censor. I can imagine cases where people's lives are at stake imminently, and in First Amendment law has such cases as well. But I've tried to sort of say something about generally how do we feel about this as a strategy.
Other questions? I was wondering, you made a couple of observations there during the talk that pointing out that something is questionable or false to varying degrees, etc. Like what we heard in the morning, you said in your context it is effective, and I was just wondering why it's such a huge difference in observations.
Oh, why I said it works when this morning Miriam said it doesn't work? I think that, well, maybe we're reading different papers, but I think also I'm taking a longer term view. So most of the research on the effectiveness is sort of one experiment. And indeed, if I tell you once that something is false, I'm going to have very little effect. But there seems to also be a strand of research that says that if you repeat it long enough and often enough, it does have some effects. The studies I'm thinking of are from Rand, actually. So the Rand people believe that this is the case, and of course that's cited in the paper.
I mean, so how does that reconcile with confirmation bias that people are well known to be subject to, right? So, for example, if I already have pre-existing beliefs, even if you tell me that what I'm reading or hearing or consuming is false or questionable, so what if I dig in and this seems to sort of challenge that kind of conventional wisdom about confirmation bias.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what to tell you except to say that at the very least, I claim that it is widely believed that continually repeating a message will eventually have some effect. And as I said, there's a strand of research, but also if you just look at what organizations are actually doing, repeating that message has been a staple of propaganda and counter-propaganda for centuries. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank Jonathan again for a great talk.